The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing my monthly budget at the kitchen table. The same table where Margaret and I had planned 42 years of family finances, where we'd taught David basic arithmetic when he was 7, where we'd celebrated his acceptance to business school 25 years ago. Now David was 38, married to Jessica, living in a house that cost more than I'd made in my last 5 years of work, and asking me to risk everything I'd spent a lifetime building. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying that particular mixture of confidence and urgency that I'd learned to recognize as trouble. "I've got an incredible opportunity, but I need your help to make it happen." I set down my coffee and reached for the pen I kept next to the calculator. Old habits from 4 decades as a forensic accountant. When someone starts talking about opportunities that require help, you start taking notes. David explained that he'd developed a revolutionary investment platform that would democratize wealth building for ordinary people. He used phrases like disruptive technology and unprecedented returns and first-mover advantage with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been practicing the pitch in mirrors. The opportunity, he said, was a chance to get in on the ground floor of something that would change how regular people built retirement wealth. He'd already secured commitments from several high-net-worth individuals, but he needed additional capital to scale the platform and bring in the institutional investors who would really make the difference. That's where I came in. The bank would approve a business loan if I co-signed, he explained. My credit history, my assets, my reputation in the financial community would provide the security they needed to fund his vision. "It's not just about the money, Dad," David said. "It's about believing in me. It's about being part of something that's going to help thousands of people build the kind of security you and Mom were able to create." I asked him how much money he was talking about. $500,000, he said. "I know it sounds like a lot, but the projections show we'll be profitable within 18 months. And Dad, I'm talking about returns that could set you up for the kind of retirement you and Mom always dreamed about." $500,000. The number sat on the kitchen table between my coffee cup and my monthly budget like a small explosive device. I told David I'd need to see the business plan, the financial projections, the legal documentation. I'd need to understand exactly what I'd be risking and what the realistic outcomes might be. "Of course," David said, "absolutely. But Dad, the timeline is pretty tight. The investment window closes at the end of next week, and if we don't move fast, we'll lose the opportunity entirely." Time pressure. Another red flag from my professional experience. Legitimate investments don't disappear if you take time to do proper due diligence. I told David I'd review everything he could send me, but I wasn't making any decisions without thoroughly understanding what I was getting into. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the notes I'd taken. Revolutionary platform, unprecedented returns, first-mover advantage, tight timeline. In 40 years of investigating financial fraud, I'd heard those same phrases in dozens of cases that ended with ordinary people losing their life savings. But this was my son, the boy I'd taught to balance a checkbook, who'd graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, who'd worked at 2 prestigious investment firms before starting his own consulting practice. Surely David understood the risks better than the typical victims I'd seen in my professional life. That afternoon, a courier delivered a thick manila envelope to my front door. David's business plan, beautifully bound and professionally printed, filled with charts and graphs and testimonials from satisfied early investors. I spread the documents across my dining room table and began reading with the systematic attention I'd brought to thousands of financial investigations over the course of my career. The business model was elegant in its simplicity. David's platform would pool investments from individual contributors and deploy the capital using proprietary algorithms that identified undervalued opportunities in emerging markets. The returns would be shared proportionally among investors, minus a reasonable management fee for the platform. The projected returns were impressive, 12 to 15% annually, significantly higher than traditional investment vehicles, but not so astronomical as to trigger immediate skepticism. The testimonials were compelling. Early investors described consistent returns, professional communication, and the satisfaction of being part of something innovative and socially beneficial. But as I worked through the documentation, small discrepancies began to emerge. Numbers that didn't quite align between different sections, references to regulatory approvals that seemed vague when I tried to verify them. Investment strategies that sounded sophisticated but became less clear the more carefully I analyzed them. By evening, I had filled 3 legal pads with questions and concerns, not smoking guns but enough inconsistencies to make me uncomfortable putting my name on a $500,000 loan. I called David that night. "Dad," he said, before I could speak, "I know you probably have some questions about the technical details. That's exactly what I expected from someone with your background." I told him I had more than a few questions. I had serious concerns about several aspects of the business model and the financial projections. "Look," David said, "I get it. You're being careful, which is what you've always taught me to be. But sometimes being too careful means missing opportunities that could change everything." He suggested we meet in person so he could walk me through the details that might not be clear from the written materials. There were nuances, he said, that were difficult to capture in formal documentation. We arranged to meet at his office the following Thursday. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the confidence in David's voice, the professional quality of the documentation, the testimonials from satisfied investors. But I also kept thinking about the small inconsistencies I'd noticed, the time pressure he'd mentioned, the way he'd deflected my specific questions. I got up around 2 in the morning and went to my home office, where I kept files from some of my most memorable cases. I pulled out a folder labeled Ponzi Investigation 2018 and spread the contents across my desk. The similarities were unsettling. Charismatic leader promising exceptional returns. Professional documentation with impressive testimonials. Time pressure to invest before missing the opportunity. Complex investment strategies that became less clear under scrutiny. But those were characteristics of financial fraud in general. They didn't necessarily apply to David's legitimate business opportunity. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret died 3 years ago. I called my former colleague, Patricia Chen, who'd worked with me on some of the most complex fraud cases in the state's attorney's office. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I need a favor. I need someone to look at some financial documents with fresh eyes." We met for lunch at the same restaurant where we used to debrief after particularly difficult cases. Patricia had retired 5 years ago, but her analytical skills were as sharp as ever. I handed her David's business plan without explaining who had prepared it. She spent 20 minutes reading through the key sections, making notes on a napkin, asking clarifying questions that I answered as best I could. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I recognized from dozens of previous investigations. "Richard," she said, "whoever put this together is very good at making sophisticated fraud look like legitimate investment opportunity." I told her it was David's business plan. Patricia's expression didn't change, but I could see something shift behind her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but the patterns are all there. Complex strategies that don't hold up under analysis, returns that are possible but not sustainable, early investor testimonials that sound like they were written by the same person." She pointed to specific sections of the documentation, explaining how legitimate investment disclosures differed from what David had provided. Most importantly, she said, there's no clear explanation of how the money actually generates returns. It's all algorithms and emerging markets and proprietary strategies, but there's no concrete description of where the profits actually come from. I thanked Patricia for her analysis and drove home with a sick feeling in my stomach. That evening, David called to confirm our meeting for Thursday. "Actually," he said, "I've got some great news. We've had such strong interest from potential investors that we're probably going to close the investment window early. If you can make a decision by Friday, I can guarantee your participation at the founder level." Another pressure tactic. I told David I'd see him Thursday as planned. After we hung up, I sat in Margaret's chair by the living room window and thought about the boy who used to ask me to check his math homework, who'd called me from college excited about his economics classes, who'd sent me a dozen roses when he got his first job at Morgan Stanley. Somewhere between that eager young man and the polished professional who was now asking me to risk my retirement security, something had gone wrong. The question was whether David had been drawn into something he didn't fully understand, or whether he was the one doing the drawing. Thursday morning, I loaded David's documents into my briefcase along with Patricia's notes and a small digital recorder I'd used in my investigative work. If my son was running a Ponzi scheme, I was going to find out. And if he was, I was going to stop him before he destroyed any more lives than he might have already. The drive to David's office took 45 minutes through morning traffic that gave me plenty of time to think about the conversation ahead. 40 years of investigating financial fraud had taught me that the most dangerous criminals were often the ones who convinced themselves they were helping people. I had a feeling I was about to find out which category my son fell into. David's office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that announced success before you even stepped inside the lobby. His company name, Meridian Capital Solutions, was etched into brushed steel lettering behind the reception desk. The young woman who greeted me had the polished professionalism of someone who'd been trained to make visitors feel both welcome and impressed. She offered me coffee in a real ceramic mug, not the disposable cups you'd expect at a startup. Everything about the office communicated stability, prosperity, legitimacy, which, I knew from experience, was exactly the point. David emerged from a corner office wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. He embraced me with the kind of warmth that felt both genuine and performed, leading me past workstations where young professionals focused intently on computer screens filled with charts and data. "Dad," he said, settling behind a mahogany desk that would have impressed clients and intimidated competitors, "thank you for taking the time to come in. I know you've got questions, and I want to address every single one of them." I pulled out my legal pad, now filled with 3 pages of concerns and inconsistencies I'd identified in his business plan. "David," I said, "I've spent 40 years investigating financial fraud. I know what legitimate investments look like, and I know what sophisticated scams look like. What you've shown me has characteristics of both." His smile never wavered, but I saw something flicker behind his eyes. The same expression he'd worn as a teenager when I'd caught him in elaborate lies about where he'd been or what he'd been doing. "I understand your caution," he said. "It's exactly what I'd expect from someone with your background. But Dad, sometimes the most legitimate opportunities look suspicious to people who spent their careers focused on fraud." I asked him to walk me through the actual investment strategy. Not the marketing language, but the specific mechanisms that would generate 12 to 15% returns in a market where Treasury bonds were yielding 3%. David launched into an explanation involving algorithmic trading, emerging market arbitrage, and proprietary risk assessment models. It sounded impressive, but when I pressed for specifics, his answers became increasingly vague. "The algorithms are proprietary," he said. "I can't share the exact methodology without compromising our competitive advantage." I told him that was fine, but I needed to understand the basic economics. Where exactly were the profits coming from? "Multiple revenue streams," David said. "Trading spreads, market inefficiencies, currency fluctuations. It's a diversified approach that minimizes risk while maximizing return potential." I made notes while he spoke, but nothing he said explained how his platform could consistently outperform professional fund managers with decades of experience and billions in resources. "David," I said, "I need you to show me the actual trading activity. Account statements, transaction records, proof that these strategies are generating the returns you're promising to investors." That's when his demeanor shifted. The polished confidence gave way to something that looked like annoyance mixed with desperation. "Dad," he said, "I'm not going to compromise our investors' privacy by sharing confidential account information. You're going to have to trust that the business is performing exactly as advertised. Trust." The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. I told David that trust had to be earned with transparency, and that asking me to co-sign a $500,000 loan based on trust alone was unreasonable. That's when he played his trump card. "You know what, Dad? Maybe this isn't about the business at all. Maybe this is about you not believing in me. Maybe this is about you thinking your son isn't capable of succeeding without your constant supervision and approval." It was a masterful manipulation, turning my legitimate concerns into evidence of my failure as a supportive father. 20 years ago, it might have worked. But 40 years of investigating fraud had taught me that the most dangerous moment in any investigation is when it becomes personal. I told David I'd need the weekend to think about everything we'd discussed. He walked me to the elevator, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt both affectionate and possessive. "Dad," he said as the elevator doors opened, "I know you're going to make the right decision. You've always been smart about money, and this is the smartest money decision you'll ever make." The ride down 14 floors gave me time to think about what I'd just witnessed. The impressive office, the polished presentation, the deflection when I asked for specifics, the emotional manipulation when deflection failed. I'd seen it all before, in dozens of cases involving sophisticated financial fraud. The only difference was that this time, the perpetrator was my son. That evening, I sat in my home office and did what I'd done thousands of times during my career. I opened a new investigation file. I labeled it Meridian Capital Solutions, Potential Ponzi Scheme, and began documenting everything I'd observed and learned over the past week. David's business plan went into the file, along with Patricia's analysis and my own notes from our meeting. I created a timeline of events and a list of questions that needed answers. But there was one more thing I needed to do before I could proceed with any confidence. I needed to find David's investors. The testimonials in his business plan included first names and general descriptions, but no contact information. Sarah M., retired teacher from Springfield, couldn't be happier with her decision to invest. Bob R., small business owner, has seen consistent returns for 8 months. Generic descriptions that could refer to anyone or to no one at all. But David had mentioned securing commitments from high-net-worth individuals. In my experience, wealthy investors didn't stay anonymous when they were happy with exceptional returns. They talked about their successes, recommended opportunities to friends, built networks around shared financial strategies. I started with David's social media presence. His LinkedIn profile listed dozens of connections, many of whom I recognized as successful professionals and business owners from our community. I began making phone calls. The first 3 people I reached had never heard of Meridian Capital Solutions. They knew David as Jessica's husband, the young man who'd married into a prominent local family, but they had no knowledge of his investment platform. The 4th call was different. "Richard," the voice said when I identified myself, "thank God you called. I've been trying to reach David for 2 weeks, and he's not returning my messages." The speaker was Harold Fleming, a retired dentist whose practice I'd helped him sell 5 years earlier. Harold had always been a conservative investor, the kind of man who preferred certificates of deposit to stock market volatility. "Harold," I said carefully, "are you invested in David's company?" There was a pause that lasted long enough for me to understand the answer before he gave it. "$25,000, Harold said. "My entire emergency fund. David convinced me it was a safe way to generate income for retirement, and for the first 6 months, everything looked great." I asked Harold what had happened in the past 2 weeks. "The payments stopped," Harold said. "Every month like clockwork, I'd get a check for $1,200. Then in November, nothing. When I called David's office, they kept saying he was in meetings or out of town." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Monthly payments to investors from new investor contributions was the classic hallmark of a Ponzi scheme. "Harold," I said, "how many other people do you know who invested with David?" That was when the full scope of what my son had done began to emerge. Harold gave me the names of 6 other retirees who'd invested with Meridian Capital Solutions. All of them were people I knew from our community, friends and acquaintances who trusted David because of his connection to me. George Martinez, who'd invested his late wife's life insurance settlement. Dorothy Chen, who'd moved her entire IRA into David's platform. Frank Rodriguez, who'd liquidated his pension to take advantage of what David had called a limited-time opportunity for serious investors. All of them had received monthly payments for 6 to 8 months. All of them had stopped receiving payments in November. All of them had been unable to reach David when they tried to inquire about their accounts. I spent the rest of the evening making calls, documenting what each investor had been told, how much they'd contributed, and when their payments had stopped. By midnight, I had identified 12 victims who'd lost a combined total of nearly $300,000. $300,000 that had probably never been invested in anything except David's lifestyle, and the monthly payments designed to keep earlier investors satisfied while he recruited new ones. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the notes I'd compiled, trying to reconcile the numbers with the son who'd called me Dad with such warmth just 12 hours earlier. The mathematics were clear. David had been running a classic Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay existing investors while diverting the rest for personal use. The scheme had collapsed when he'd run out of new victims to recruit, which explained why he'd become so desperate to secure the $500,000 loan I'd refused to co-sign. What wasn't clear was how long he'd known what he was doing, or whether he'd convinced himself that he could make the returns real if he just had enough capital to work with. The difference mattered for prosecution, but it didn't matter for the victims who'd lost their retirement savings. I called Patricia Chen at 7 the next morning. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I need help with an active fraud investigation." She listened while I explained what I'd discovered about David's operation, the scope of the victimization, and the evidence I'd compiled. "Richard," she said when I finished, "you know what you have to do." I told her I knew. "You have to report him," she said. "Tonight. Every day you wait is another day. those victims spend wondering if they'll ever see their money again. I also knew that reporting David would end any possibility of our relationship recovering from what he'd done. But as I thought about Harold Fleming's emergency fund and Dorothy Chen's IRA, I realized that our relationship had ended the moment David decided to use my reputation to legitimize his fraud. That afternoon, I drove to the district attorney's office and requested a meeting with the Financial Crimes Unit. The investigator who met with me was younger than David, but he had the same focused attention I remembered from my own career. He listened while I presented my evidence, asked intelligent questions about the investment structure, and made careful notes about each victim I'd identified. "Mr. Dalton," he said when I finished my presentation, "this is solid preliminary work. We'll need to verify everything independently, but you've given us an excellent foundation for a full investigation." He explained that they begin with subpoenas for David's business and personal banking records, followed by interviews with identified victims and a forensic audit of Meridian Capital Solutions' financial activity. The process would take several months, he warned, but cases like this typically ended with criminal charges if the evidence supported the allegations. I thanked him for his time and drove home to wait for the phone call I knew was coming. David called at 8 that evening. "Dad," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I just got a very interesting phone call from Harold Fleming. He said you've been asking questions about his investment with my company." I told David that I'd been doing my due diligence before making a decision about the loan. "Due diligence," David repeated. "Is that what you call spreading rumors about my business? Is that what you call undermining my relationships with my investors?" I told David that if he was running a legitimate business, my questions shouldn't threaten those relationships. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to understand that David knew I'd discovered the truth about Meridian Capital Solutions. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the polished professional who'd presented investment opportunities in his impressive office. What remained sounded like a stranger. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. "You have no idea what this is going to cost all of us." I told David that the only thing it was going to cost was the money he'd stolen from people who trusted him. That's when he said something that made me realize how completely I'd lost the son I thought I'd raised. "Those people knew the risks when they invested," he said. "Nobody forced them to give me their money. If they were stupid enough to believe they could get something for nothing, that's on them, not on me." I hung up without responding. Later that evening, as I sat in Margaret's chair looking out at the neighborhood where Harold and Dorothy and Frank had lived for decades, building the retirement security that David had destroyed, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. I was going to make sure my son paid for every dollar he'd stolen, and every lie he'd told, and every elderly victim whose trust he'd exploited. Not as his father, but as someone who'd spent 40 years learning how to build cases that sent financial predators to prison. David had made the mistake of choosing the wrong father to defraud. 3 days after I filed my report with the district attorney's office, David showed up at my front door. It was 7 in the morning, early enough that most of the neighborhood was still getting ready for work, late enough that his presence would be noticed by anyone looking out their kitchen windows while making coffee. He didn't knock. He used the key I'd given him years ago for emergencies, the same key Margaret had insisted all our children keep in case something happened to us. I heard the front door open while I was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd first reviewed his fraudulent business plan less than 2 weeks ago. The coffee was still hot in my cup, the morning light was slanting through the windows, and suddenly my son was standing in my kitchen doorway, looking like someone who hadn't slept in days. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk." I folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside. In 40 years of investigative work, I'd learned that the most dangerous conversations were the ones that started with desperate people declaring what needed to happen. David sat down across from me without being invited. The same chair he'd occupied as a child when he'd needed to confess some transgression or ask for help with homework he'd left until the last minute. But there was nothing childlike about him now. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was crooked, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd spent recent days calculating odds that didn't work in his favor. "You've destroyed everything," he said. "Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, 20 years of building a reputation, and you've ruined it all in 1 week." I asked David if he was talking about the reputation he'd built by stealing retirement money from elderly investors. "Don't be dramatic," he said. "I never stole anything from anyone. Every investor knew the risks. Every investor signed documents acknowledging that past performance doesn't guarantee future returns." I reached for the legal pad where I'd been documenting the scope of his victims. 12 names, with more being identified every day as word spread through the community. Harold Fleming didn't know the risks when you told him his emergency fund would be safe, I said. Dorothy Chen didn't know the risks when you convinced her to move her entire IRA into your platform. David's jaw tightened. Those people made investment decisions based on their own research and their own judgment. I provided them with opportunities. What they did with those opportunities was their choice. It was the same rationalization I'd heard from dozens of financial predators over the course of my career. The victims chose to trust them, so the victims were responsible for the consequences of that trust. David, I said, I've seen the bank records. The district attorney showed me the preliminary forensic analysis. 80% of the money you collected from investors went directly into your personal accounts. You used their retirement savings to pay for your house, your cars, your office lease. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating whether denial or justification would be more effective. He chose justification. Do you have any idea what it costs to run a legitimate investment business? He asked. Office space, equipment, professional staff, marketing, compliance, legal fees. The overhead alone is enormous. I told David that legitimate investment businesses disclose their fee structures to investors instead of stealing principal to cover operational costs. It's not stealing when it's disclosed in the partnership agreements, he said. Every investor signed documents that explained how fees and expenses would be handled. I asked David to show me the language in those agreements that authorized him to use 90% of investor contributions for personal expenses. That's when his composure finally cracked. You don't understand how business works, he said, his voice rising. You've spent your whole career as a government bureaucrat, investigating other people's success instead of building anything yourself. You have no idea what it takes to create something from nothing. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they revealed how completely David had reimagined his relationship with reality. In his version of events, he was the victim of my small-minded inability to appreciate his entrepreneurial vision. I told David that what he created wasn't a business. It was a criminal enterprise designed to defraud vulnerable people. That's when he shifted tactics entirely. Dad, he said, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used as a child when he'd wanted something badly enough to beg for it. You can still fix this. You can still make this right. He explained that if I co-signed the loan we'd originally discussed, he could return most of the money to his investors and shut down the operation cleanly. No criminal charges, no ruined reputations, no families destroyed by public scandal. $500,000 would cover the outstanding obligations to investors with enough left over to pay the penalties and fees that would satisfy regulatory authorities. Everyone would get their money back, lessons would be learned, and the family could move forward without the devastating consequences of a criminal prosecution. It was a sophisticated appeal, combining my genuine concern for his victims with my natural desire to protect my son from the consequences of his choices. But 40 years of investigating fraud had taught me that the moment you help a criminal avoid consequences is the moment you become complicit in their crimes. I told David that the money was gone, and that a $500,000 loan wouldn't change the fact that he'd operated a Ponzi scheme for nearly 2 years. It's not gone, he said. It's invested in the business infrastructure that would have generated the returns if I'd had more time to develop the platform properly. I asked David to show me a single legitimate investment he'd made with his victims' money. The silence that followed was answer enough. Look, David said finally, this doesn't have to destroy both of us. You can withdraw your complaint, tell the district attorney you were mistaken about the business model, and this whole thing goes away quietly. I asked David what would happen to Harold and Dorothy and the other 10 victims who'd lost their retirement savings. They'll get over it, David said. These people have other resources. Harold has Social Security and a pension from his dental practice. Dorothy's husband left her a house that's worth twice what she lost. They're not going to starve because they made one bad investment decision. It was the moment I realized that my son wasn't just a criminal. He was a sociopath who felt no genuine remorse for the people he'd victimized. I told David that I wouldn't be withdrawing my complaint and that I'd be cooperating fully with the criminal investigation. That's when he made the mistake that convinced me I was dealing with someone dangerous rather than just someone desperate. Dad, he said, standing up from the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the course of his childhood, I really hope you understand what you're choosing here. I asked David if he was threatening me. I'm explaining consequences, he said. You think you can destroy my life without any impact on your own, but that's not how this works. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the neighborhood where he'd grown up, where most of his victims lived, where my reputation had been built over decades of honest work and community involvement. People around here trust you, he said. They respect your opinion about financial matters. But when this story comes out, when they learn that you raised a son who stole their retirement money, that trust is going to evaporate pretty quickly. The threat was implicit but clear. If I continued cooperating with the investigation, he'd make sure the community blame fell on me as much as on him. David, I said, are you trying to blackmail me into helping you avoid prosecution for fraud? I'm trying to help you understand that your decision affects more than just me, he said. Jessica doesn't deserve to have her life destroyed because you decided to play detective instead of being a supportive father. It was a masterful manipulation, making me responsible for the consequences he'd created through his own criminal choices. But it was also a strategic error. The digital recorder I'd placed on the counter next to the coffee maker had been running since David walked into my kitchen. Every word of his justification for the fraud, his admission that the money was gone, and his threats designed to prevent my cooperation with law enforcement was now preserved on a device that would be admissible in court. I told David that I thought our conversation was finished. He studied my face for a long moment, probably trying to determine whether his threats had been effective. Think about it, Dad, he said finally. Think about what you're really choosing here. You've got until tomorrow to make the right decision. After David left, I sat in my kitchen reviewing what had just happened. My son had admitted to operating a Ponzi scheme, confirmed that his victim's money was gone, and threatened to destroy my reputation if I continued cooperating with law enforcement. He'd also done it all while being recorded, which meant the district attorney now had direct evidence of his consciousness of guilt and his willingness to obstruct justice. But more importantly, David had revealed the full extent of his moral bankruptcy. He felt no remorse for his victims, no responsibility for the harm he'd caused, and no hesitation about threatening the father who'd raised him. I called the prosecutor's office and arranged to deliver the recording that afternoon. The investigator listened to the entire conversation, making notes at key points, asking clarifying questions about David's references to specific victims and investments. Mr. Dalton, he said when the recording ended, this is exactly what we needed to establish intent and consciousness of guilt. Your son just confessed to knowingly operating a fraudulent investment scheme. He explained that the investigation would now move quickly. Bank records and victim interviews had already confirmed the basic elements of the fraud, but David's admission provided the direct evidence needed for criminal charges. The arrest warrant would be issued within a week, he said. David would be charged with multiple counts of securities fraud, theft, and money laundering. I asked about the possibility of restitution for the victims. That depends on what assets we can recover, the investigator said. From what we've seen so far, most of the money went to personal expenses and lifestyle maintenance. But we'll do everything possible to maximize recovery for the victims. Driving home that evening, I thought about the boy who'd asked me to check his math homework, and the man who'd threatened to destroy my reputation for refusing to help him escape consequences for defrauding elderly neighbors. Somewhere between those two versions of my son, I'd lost him completely. But I'd gained something else, the satisfaction of knowing that Harold and Dorothy and the other victims would finally get some measure of justice. And the certainty that when David was sentenced, it would be based on evidence I'd helped gather rather than crimes I'd helped him commit. That night, I updated my investigation file with the recording and my notes from David's confession. Tomorrow, I'd begin the process of helping the prosecution build the strongest possible case against the son who'd tried to make me complicit in his fraud. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for when David first called about the loan, but it was the ending his victims deserved. The arrest happened on a Friday morning while I was having coffee with Harold Fleming at the diner on Main Street. We'd started meeting weekly after I'd helped him understand what had happened to his emergency fund. Not therapy sessions or formal support meetings, just two men in their 70s drinking coffee and talking through the practical and emotional aftermath of being victimized by someone they'd trusted. Harold was showing me the paperwork from his attorney, who specialized in asset recovery for fraud victims, when my phone buzzed with a text from the prosecutor's office. Warrant executed 8:45 a.m. Subject in custody. Will call with details. I set the phone down next to my coffee cup and realized that my hands were shaking slightly. Harold noticed. Everything all right, Richard? I told him that David had just been arrested. Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. Then he said something that surprised me. "I'm sorry, Richard, I know he's your son." I thanked Harold for the sentiment, but told him I wasn't sure David was my son anymore. The man who'd stolen Harold's emergency fund and threatened to destroy my reputation bore no resemblance to the child I'd raised. Harold nodded. "That's the hardest part about this whole thing," he said. "Not the money, though that hurts. It's realizing that someone you trusted enough to give your money to was never the person you thought they were." The prosecutor called while Harold and I were walking back to our cars. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "the arrest went smoothly. Your son was taken into custody at his office without incident. He's being processed now, and he'll be arraigned Monday morning." I asked about the charges. 18 counts, he said. Securities fraud, theft, money laundering, obstruction of justice. Based on the evidence you helped us gather and the additional victims we've identified, we're looking at substantial prison time if he's convicted. Additional victims. I asked how many people David had defrauded beyond the 12 I'd identified. 23 confirmed so far, he said. We're still processing tips from the public announcement. The total loss is approaching $600,000. $600,000 stolen from elderly neighbors who'd trusted David because they'd trusted me. That evening, Jessica called. "Dad Richard," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I need you to explain to me what you've done to my husband." I told Jessica that I hadn't done anything to David. David had done it to himself by operating a criminal enterprise. "That's not how David tells it," she said. "According to David, you've destroyed his business and his reputation because you couldn't handle him being more successful than you ever were." The accusation was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. Instead, I asked Jessica if David had told her about the 23 victims who'd lost their retirement savings to his Ponzi scheme. "David says those people knew they were taking risks when they invested," Jessica said. "He says this is just buyer's remorse from people who can't accept responsibility for their own bad decisions." I asked Jessica if she genuinely believed that Dorothy Chen and Harold Fleming had knowingly invested their life savings in a fraudulent scheme. The silence that followed suggested that Jessica was beginning to understand the gap between David's version of events and objective reality. "Dad Richard," she said finally, her voice smaller than before, "David says you recorded him without his permission. He says that's illegal in this state." I told Jessica that recording conversations in your own home was legal in every state, and that David's admission of guilt on that recording would be crucial evidence in his prosecution. "What admission of guilt?" Jessica asked. I explained that David had acknowledged stealing investor money for personal expenses, admitted that the promised returns were impossible to generate, and threatened to destroy my reputation if I continued cooperating with law enforcement. Jessica was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, she sounded like someone who was just beginning to comprehend the magnitude of her husband's crimes. "How much money are we talking about?" she asked. $600,000 so far, I said, stolen from 23 elderly investors who trusted David because of his connection to our family. That's when Jessica broke down. Through her tears, she told me about conversations she'd had with David over the past year. Questions about where their money was coming from, concerns about his evasive answers when she'd asked about his business model, warnings from her own father that David's lifestyle seemed inconsistent with the income from a startup investment company. David had explained away her concerns by claiming that his business was too sophisticated for her to understand, that her father was jealous of his success, that her questions demonstrated a lack of faith in their marriage. Classic gaslighting techniques designed to make victims doubt their own perceptions rather than question the abuser's behavior. "I was so stupid," Jessica said. "I knew something was wrong, but I let him convince me that the problem was my inability to trust him." I told Jessica that she wasn't stupid. She was married to someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of manipulation. "What happens now?" she asked. I explained that David would be arraigned Monday morning, that his attorney would probably request bail, and that the prosecution would argue for remand based on his history of fraud and his threats to interfere with the investigation. "If he's convicted," Jessica said, "how long will he be in prison?" Based on the charges and the amount of money involved, I told her, David was probably looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison. The sound she made wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a gasp. It was the sound someone makes when they realize their life is about to change in ways they'd never imagined. "Dad Richard," she said, "I need you to know that I had no idea what David was doing. I never would have been part of something like this." I believed her. Jessica was David's victim too, just in a different way than Harold and Dorothy. What about the house? She asked. What about our savings? What about everything we built together? I told Jessica that law enforcement would probably seize any assets purchased with stolen money, which might include their house, cars, and bank accounts. Everything? She asked. Probably, I said. The victims have first claim on any recoverable assets. After Jessica hung up, I sat in my living room thinking about the wreckage David had created. 23 elderly victims who'd lost their retirement security, a wife who'd been manipulated into unknowing complicity, a marriage that would probably end in divorce, a family name that would be associated with financial fraud for decades, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a father who'd been forced to choose between protecting his son and protecting his son's victims. On Sunday evening, David called from the county jail. His voice sounded different through the institutional phone system, smaller, more desperate, stripped of the confidence he'd projected during our kitchen confrontation. "Dad," he said, "I need you to post bail for me." I told David that I wouldn't be posting bail or providing any financial assistance for his defense. "You're my father," he said. "You can't just abandon me when I need you most." I told David that he'd abandoned me when he'd used my reputation to legitimize fraud against my neighbors. "Look," David said, his voice taking on the pleading tone he'd used as a child when he'd wanted something badly, "I know I made some mistakes, but the business model was sound. If I'd had more time to develop it properly, everyone would have gotten their money back with interest." I asked David if he genuinely believed that, or if he was just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. The silence that followed was answer enough. "Dad," he said finally, "what do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That I wish I'd done things differently? Fine, I'm sorry. I wish I'd been more careful about the way I structured the business." I told David that being sorry about getting caught wasn't the same as being sorry about committing the crimes. "What crimes?" David asked. "I provided investment opportunities to people who had money they wanted to grow. If the investments didn't perform as well as projected, that's not criminal fraud. That's just business risk." Even from jail, facing 18 felony charges, David was still unable to acknowledge that he'd operated a criminal enterprise designed to steal money from vulnerable people. I told David that our conversation was finished. "Dad, wait," he said, desperation replacing defiance in his voice. "Please, I'm your son. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I told David that it meant everything to me, which was why watching him destroy himself and hurt innocent people was the most painful experience of my life. But it also meant that I couldn't help him avoid consequences for choices that had harmed people I cared about. I hung up before David could respond. The arraignment was Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I sat in the back of the courtroom, watching the son I'd raised stand before a federal judge in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. David's attorney requested bail, arguing that his client was a lifelong resident of the community with strong family ties and no history of violence. The prosecutor argued for remand, citing the substantial flight risk posed by someone facing decades in prison and the evidence that David had threatened witnesses and attempted to obstruct justice. The judge denied bail. As David was led back to the holding area, he turned and looked directly at me. Not with anger or defiance, but with the expression of someone who was finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences. I didn't look away. That afternoon, I drove to Harold Fleming's house to tell him that David would remain in jail until his trial. Harold invited me in for coffee, and we sat in his kitchen talking about justice and consequences and the strange satisfaction that comes from seeing someone held accountable for their actions. "It doesn't bring the money back," Harold said, "but it means something that he can't keep doing this to other people." I agreed that it meant something. But as I drove home that evening, I realized that the hardest part of this entire experience was still ahead of me. David's trial would probably last several months. I'd be called as a witness to testify about the evidence I'd gathered and the conversations I recorded. I'd have to explain to a jury how my own son had tried to manipulate me into helping him escape justice. And through it all, I'd have to live with the knowledge that the child I'd raised had become someone capable of stealing retirement money from elderly neighbors without remorse. But I'd also have to live with the satisfaction of knowing that when 23 victims finally received some measure of justice, it would be because I'd chosen their interests over my son's. That was a choice I could live with, even if it meant living with it alone. The trial began on a cold Tuesday in March, 8 months after David's arrest. I arrived at the federal courthouse 45 minutes early, not because I was anxious about testifying, but because I wanted to sit in the gallery and watch the jury selection process. 40 years of investigating financial fraud had taught me that the most important part of any trial happens before the first witness is called. The prosecutor and defense attorney spent 3 hours questioning potential jurors about their attitudes toward investment fraud, their personal experiences with financial losses, and their ability to remain objective when evaluating evidence against someone's adult child. That last question was directed specifically at me, though neither attorney mentioned my name directly. By noon, they'd seated 12 jurors and 2 alternates. 8 women and 6 men, mostly middle-aged and older, the kind of people who understood what it meant to save for retirement and plan for financial security. The kind of people who would identify with Harold Fleming and Dorothy Chen rather than with David. The prosecutor's opening statement was methodical and devastating. She laid out the timeline of David's Ponzi scheme, the techniques he'd used to recruit victims, the lifestyle he'd funded with their retirement savings, and the web of lies he'd constructed to keep the fraud operational. She explained that over 27 months, David had collected $847,000 from 26 victims, returned $394,000 in fake profits to maintain the illusion of legitimate returns, and used the remaining $453,000 to pay for his house, cars, office lease, and personal expenses. The defense attorney's opening was less convincing. He argued that David had operated a legitimate investment business that had failed due to market conditions beyond his control, that any personal use of investor funds was disclosed in partnership agreements, and that the victims were sophisticated investors who understood the risks involved. It was the same defense strategy I'd seen in dozens of similar cases over my career. Blame the victims for being naive, characterize theft as failed business practices, and hope the jury would believe that good intentions could excuse criminal behavior. On Wednesday morning, I was called to testify. The prosecutor walked me through my background in forensic accounting, my initial concerns about David's business plan, and the investigation I'd conducted after discovering the scope of his fraud. She played the recording I'd made during David's confession in my kitchen, where he'd admitted that investor money was gone and threatened to destroy my reputation if I continued cooperating with law enforcement. The courtroom was completely silent during the playback. When David's voice came through the speakers saying that his victims would get over it because they had other resources, I saw several jurors look directly at him with expressions of disgust. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to portray me as a bitter father who'd sabotaged his son's business out of jealousy, as someone who'd betrayed family loyalty for personal revenge, as a retired bureaucrat who couldn't understand modern investment strategies. But 40 years of testifying in financial fraud cases had prepared me for every attack he attempted. When he suggested that I'd recorded David illegally, I calmly explained the state laws regarding single-party consent for recordings made in private residences. When he implied that I'd misinterpreted David's business model due to my limited experience with innovative investment strategies, I walked the jury through the forensic analysis that showed exactly where every dollar of investor money had gone. When he accused me of putting my desire for revenge ahead of my family relationships, I looked directly at the jury and said that protecting 26 elderly victims from continued fraud was more important than protecting one criminal from the consequences of his choices. The cross-examination lasted 4 hours. By the end, the defense attorney was repeating the same ineffective questions while I provided the same devastating answers. That evening, Jessica called me for the first time since David's arrest. "I watched you testify today," she said. "I was in the gallery." I hadn't seen her, but the courtroom had been crowded with victims, journalists, and community members who wanted to witness David's prosecution. "Jessica," I said, "how are you holding up?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised me. "I'm proud of you, Dad Richard. What you did today, explaining everything to the jury, showing them who David really is. It couldn't have been easy." I told Jessica that it was the hardest thing I'd ever done professionally. But it was the right thing, she said. Those people deserved to have someone speak for them. Jessica told me that she'd filed for divorce the previous month, that she'd lost the house and both cars to asset forfeiture, that she was living with her parents and working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. "I should have listened to you from the beginning," she said. "I should have asked harder questions when you first raised concerns about David's business." I told Jessica that David had manipulated her the same way he'd manipulated his investors, using trust and affection to prevent critical thinking. The prosecution's case took 6 days. Victim after victim testified about how David had convinced them to invest their life savings, about the monthly payments that had made the scheme seem legitimate, about the devastating impact of losing retirement security to someone they'd trusted. Harold Fleming's testimony was particularly powerful. He explained that he'd invested his emergency fund based on David's promise that the money would be safe and accessible, that he'd received consistent returns for 8 months, and that he'd been unable to reach David when the payments stopped. The defense attorney tried to suggest that Harold had understood the risks involved in the investment, that he'd signed documents acknowledging that past performance didn't guarantee future results, that his losses were the result of poor judgment rather than criminal fraud. Harold looked directly at the jury and said something that I knew would stay with them during deliberations. "I didn't invest my emergency fund in a risky business venture," he said. "I trusted a young man who promised me safety and delivered theft." The defense case lasted 2 days. David's attorney called character witnesses who testified about his reputation in the community, his charitable contributions, his role as a devoted husband and son. But he didn't call David to testify in his own defense. During closing arguments, the prosecutor reminded the jury that David had admitted stealing investor money, that he'd shown no remorse for his victims, and that he'd threatened to obstruct justice when confronted with evidence of his crimes. The defense attorney made a final appeal for sympathy, arguing that David was a young man who'd made mistakes under pressure, that he deserved a second chance to make things right with his victims, that destroying his life wouldn't restore the money his investors had lost. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered guilty verdicts on all 18 charges. David showed no emotion when the verdicts were read. He sat perfectly still while the judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, while his attorney requested that he remain free on recognizance pending appeal, while the prosecutor argued successfully for immediate remand. As David was led away in handcuffs, he looked at me one final time. There was no anger in his expression, no defiance, no appeal for sympathy or forgiveness. There was just the look of someone who finally understood that 40 years of forensic accounting experience had prepared me to build an unassailable case against anyone who committed financial fraud, even if that person was my son. The sentencing hearing was on a Friday afternoon in May. Judge Morrison had reviewed the pre-sentence investigation report, the victim impact statements, and the financial analysis that showed the full scope of David's crimes. Before imposing sentence, he asked if David wanted to make a statement to the court. David stood slowly and faced the gallery where his victims sat, waiting for acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible in the large courtroom, "I want the victims to know that I'm sorry for what happened to their investments. I never intended for anyone to lose money, and I wish I could undo the financial harm I've caused." It was not an admission of guilt or an acceptance of responsibility. It was a carefully crafted non-apology that acknowledged harm without admitting intentional wrongdoing. Judge Morrison was not impressed. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, "you have shown no genuine remorse for operating a sophisticated fraud that targeted elderly members of your community. You have expressed no understanding of the devastating impact your crimes have had on people who trusted you with their life savings." He sentenced David to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and restitution of $453,000 to be paid at a rate of 25% of his post-incarceration income. As David was led away for the final time, several victims approached me in the courthouse hallway. Harold Fleming shook my hand and thanked me for choosing them over my son. Dorothy Chen hugged me and said that watching me testify against David had restored her faith that some people still chose justice over family loyalty. Frank Rodriguez told me that he'd never forget that I'd sacrificed my relationship with my son to protect people I barely knew. But the person whose words meant the most was someone I hadn't expected to see at the sentencing. Patricia Chen, my former colleague who'd first identified the red flags in David's business plan, approached me as I was leaving the courthouse. "Richard," she said, "I've worked financial fraud cases for 30 years. I've never seen someone build a more thorough case against their own family member. You should be proud of the work you did." I told Patricia that pride wasn't what I was feeling. "No," she said, "but you should. You prevented David from victimizing more people. You helped recover some assets for his existing victims, and you demonstrated that financial crime has consequences regardless of family relationships." That evening, I sat in Margaret's chair by the living room window and thought about the 2-year journey from David's initial loan request to his federal prison sentence. I thought about the moment I'd first suspected that his business plan contained elements of fraud. I thought about the phone calls to his victims, the meetings with prosecutors, the months of building evidence that would eventually send my son to prison. I thought about the choice I'd made to prioritize the welfare of 26 elderly victims over the comfort of maintaining family relationships built on enabling criminal behavior. It had been the right choice, even though it had cost me the son I'd raised and loved. 2 weeks after David's sentencing, I received a letter forwarded from the federal prison where he was serving his sentence. "Dad," it read, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I know you think I got what I deserved. But I need you to know that I understand now what I did wrong. It wasn't the business model that was the problem. It was the way I handled people's money and the way I communicated with investors. If I'd been more transparent about the risks and more careful about managing expenses, none of this would have happened. I never intended to hurt anyone. I genuinely believed I could generate the returns I promised, and when that became impossible, I panicked instead of being honest with people who'd trusted me. I know it's too late to change what happened, but I wanted you to know that I don't blame you for testifying against me. You did what you thought was right, and I respect that even if I wish you'd found a way to help me fix things instead of destroying everything I'd built. Maybe someday we can have a relationship again. Maybe someday I can prove to you that I'm not the person you think I am. Love, David." I read the letter twice, then filed it with the other documents from David's case. Even from federal prison, David couldn't acknowledge that he'd operated a criminal enterprise designed to steal money from vulnerable people. He still characterized his fraud as poor communication and expense management rather than deliberate theft. Some people never learn the difference between being sorry for getting caught and being sorry for committing crimes. But 26 elderly victims had received some measure of justice, and David would spend the next 12 years unable to defraud anyone else. That was enough. 3 months later, I was having coffee with Harold Fleming at our usual table in the diner on Main Street when a young woman approached our table. "Excuse me," she said, "are you Richard Dalton?" I told her I was. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she said. "My grandfather lost $15,000 to someone running an investment scam last year. The police said there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute, but I've been researching similar cases online." She pulled out a folder filled with printed emails and financial documents. "I found news articles about your son's case, and I was wondering if you might be willing to look at what happened to my grandfather. I think the person who defrauded him is still operating, and I don't know how to stop him." I looked at the folder, then at Harold, then back at Sarah Martinez. 40 years of investigating financial fraud had taught me that the work never really ends. There's always another predator targeting vulnerable people, always another family that needs help building a case for justice. I told Sarah I'd be happy to review her grandfather's case. After all, protecting elderly people from financial fraud wasn't just my former profession, it had become my calling. I hope this story resonated with you, especially those navigating the difficult balance between family loyalty and protecting vulnerable people from harm. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes love means holding people accountable for their actions, even when those people are our own children. If this story touched you, please show your support with a like and subscribe for more tales of courage, justice, and the strength that comes from choosing what's right over what's comfortable. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, or let us know where you're listening from around the world. These stories about family, moral courage, and the price of doing what's right connect us across all cultures and backgrounds. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complex terrain of family bonds, financial crime, and the profound strength required to protect the innocent, even when it costs us the relationships we hold most dear. Until next time, remember, justice isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that actions have consequences and that the vulnerable are protected from those who would exploit them.